Welcome. You are about to view a recorded talk from the online seminar series, Progress and Visions in the Scientific Study of the Mind-Matter Relation, held in 2018. The seminars aim to bring together researchers from around the globe with a background in mathematics or physics who are interested in the scientific study of consciousness and the mind-matter relation. While each seminar session consists of a talk and a discussion, the latter is not recorded, and the following video will only contain the talk. We hope you enjoy it. For further information, please visit mind-matter-relation.org.
Yeah, Johannes and Robin, thank you very, very much for this invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. And of course, thank you to everyone who joined. So the title of my talk is Topologically Structured Phenomenal Spaces. I will explain in a moment what I mean by this. And the image of nature, which is more a bit a philosophical second part of my talk. So on the first slide, you see I start with a quote by a German philosopher, Friedrich Wilhelm Joseph Schelling, who said that nature is visible spirit and spirit is invisible nature. I think that's a very nice motto for me and for my work. I will present you today more of a general research framework, which I'm currently working on. And as part of that, it's the first part of my talk, a more particular model which I've worked on during my PhD studies. So it mainly focuses on the first part where I say nature is visible spirit, maybe a little less nice. I would say it's a framework for mathematized phenomenology, and I also go a little bit beyond that in this talk. So maybe to give you a rough idea about the methodological framework or the methodological ideas which I'm kind of appealing to in this talk. So the seminar is devoted to the scientific study of the mind-matter relation. So I thought I kind of sketch two approaches, or distinguish two approaches to study the mind-matter relation. One, which I think is the more customary approach today, is to think about the mind-matter relation in terms of objects, physical objects, could be more abstract objects or their properties, and trying to connect that with mind or with consciousness. And there are many approaches out there. Neuroscience, where you study what the brain does and try to think, oh, the mind is what the brain does, to more abstract things like global workspace theory, integrated information theory, self-model theory, maybe quantum brain biology, where you look for quantum effects, whether they play a role in cognition. I think those are very interesting research fields, but I would like to distinguish a second approach which one could take to the mind-matter relation, which doesn't start with physical objects or objects more generally, but start with subjectivity and try to approach the mind-matter relation in terms of subjectivity. So what I mean by this is to take subjectivity as a primitive of your theory and then try to build something like a theory or a science of pure experience or of subjectivity. And the question is, how could one do that? And one possibility, which I will expand on in the next few slides, is to study the so-called structures and invariants of consciousness to kind of get to the bare essentials of the theory. So again, as a motto, not how any supposed transition from brain to mind works, which is called bracketing in phenomenology. I will come to that in a moment, but ask instead how subjectivity could be constitutive for the formation of objects. And that's the kind of second approach which I would like to take with respect to the mind-matter relation. So if you look at the history of philosophy, I'm of course not the first one to propose a project which kind of tries to start with subjectivity and then comes to everything else from there. There was a famous school in philosophy called Phenomenology, which originated around 1900, and they claimed to study as they call it, the things as they appear in consciousness, and they said they go back to the things themselves. The founder of phenomenology is a philosopher, well-known philosopher called Edmund Husserl. One of the problems with phenomenology is that there are really many schools of phenomenology. So pretty soon after Husserl established phenomenology, it kind of branched into different schools. There was existentialist phenomenology, there was the classical Husserlian phenomenology, naturalized phenomenology. So very different schools which kind of were established in the course of the 20th century. Approach the mind-matter relation, or another topic, in terms of a coherent, unified framework. But I think that there is hope. Edmund Husserl, his background was actually not in philosophy, or not only in philosophy, but also in mathematics. He was a very accomplished mathematician. He did his PhD in mathematics. He worked for several years as a researcher in mathematics. Husserl was an assistant to Karl Weierstrass, another famous German mathematician. And I thought that might be interesting to some of the organizers. Husserl did his PhD on the calculus of variations. So he was really a fine mathematician, but with like 40 or 45, he kind of decided to go more into philosophy. And that's the time when he kind of conceived of phenomenology, which took over his career, which took many different turns, but still, the origins of phenomenology are actually mathematics. And Husserl conceived of the role of phenomenology to be very similar to the role of mathematics. So he said, phenomenology to psychology is like mathematics to physics. So phenomenology is not just, as it is sometimes said today, it's not something like an introspectionist enterprise, but it's really about getting to the structures of consciousness, getting to the necessary, he called it essences. Maybe that's a bit of an unfashionable word now, but he tried to say, oh, the essence of consciousness is the structural invariant of experience. And that's what he was claiming to kind of illuminate. Now, to summarize, three main features that kind of figure very often in phenomenological considerations of the mind-matter relations are following three things. Conscious experience is said to be situated, to be unitary, and to be transcendental. In a minute, I will explain what I mean by this in a little bit more detail, but here I just want to note that there's these three characteristics, or let's say dimensions of consciousness, which phenomenologists often talk about: situatedness, unity, and transcendentalism. To all of these topics, there are many works which have been written, some even like semi-formal. However, there's no unified mathematical model that kind of accounts for situatedness, unity, and transcendentalism in one. And one thing I want to do is to kind of construct a model that consistently represents all of these three claims about consciousness, because it could be, or it seems that this is very close to what Husserl means with a structural invariant, or with the essence of experience. And one possible approach that I take is to define so-called phenomenal spaces, where phenomenal spaces are spaces that are defined on a set of experiences, which are, the spaces are topologically structured, and this topology defines, in some sense, more complex experiences, which, so to say, live on top these less complex but elementary experiences. So I first explain these three items. So situatedness, what do I mean by it? Phenomenologists sometimes say that, or often say that, every act of consciousness is given against, that's like phenomenological terminology, every act of consciousness is given against a background which comprises the interactions between a subject and its environment. So a very easy example, if you have a conscious experience as of a tomato, this experience is given against my standing in a vegetable patch. Now, I want to stress here that took me quite some time to figure that out. When one speaks of the environment, it need not be identical to the physical environment, but it could be a social environment. So my experience is embedded in other minds, or it could be just the mind that certain kind of plays with itself. So experience is kind of embedded in more of a general experiential context. So more generally, conscious experiences are embedded in other experiences, and I use a nice French word for that, the milieu. It's very similar to the word environment, but it has a bit different connotations. So I would say experiences are embedded or situated in the milieu, and that's one of the, or that's actually the first characteristic of consciousness, which I want to treat here. The second characteristic is called as the unity of consciousness. That's a quite well-known thing. Probably many of you have heard about the unity of consciousness in some sense. Problem with the unity of consciousness, it's very often appealed to, but always a bit differently. So maybe the rough picture would be something like that consciousness does not factorize into distinct components. They're not distinct parts of consciousness, but consciousness, so to speak, comes as a whole to you. So again, the example, the tomato, it seems that my experience as of a tomato is something else than just the composition of my experience as of redness and my experience as of a ball. It's somehow, my experience of a tomato is somehow unified with respect to redness, with respect to shape, with respect to all the other things which are relevant here. And there has been an attempt to kind of formalize this unity thesis, or like semi-formalize this unity thesis in the work of David Chalmers and Tim Bain, both quite well-known philosophers of mind. And they said something like, I tried to translate it into this formula. So whenever you have a phenomenal state X, like whenever you have this experience of a tomato, there exists a more global state which kind of subsumes this state X. So it doesn't really tell us what this subsumption exactly means, but it should get across this idea of unity in terms of being subsumed under a more global state. So that's the second dimension of consciousness. And the third one, that's more philosophical concept. Again, it's called transcendentalism, or a transcendental idea of consciousness. There's not only an empirical notion of unity. So unity is not something, it's not only something which we kind of find in the world, but unity is also something which, in Kantian language, the mind brings or imposes on the world. So what this means is the mind or consciousness imposes a certain kind of structure on our theory. That's the, I would say, the traditional transcendentalist reading. Note that the transcendentalist reading is probably the hardest one to formalize, because transcendental philosophers, they often assume that there actually is no single objective structure out there which is somehow mapped by the mind. Structures are brought to the world by the mind. So subjectivity, or intuition, as the philosophers call it, is something that is shaped in the process of experiencing. It's not just a representation of what is out there, but it's really shaping which is done by the organism. So again, in the easy example of the tomato, there is actually no physical object to which the tomato corresponds. There is just some activity which gets shaped into the form as of a tomato. Okay. So now I want to introduce the concept of a phenomenal space in order to account for these phenomenological findings. And the idea of a phenomenal space is that a phenomenal space is a mathematical construct which is defined on a set of so-called elementary experiences. You can say it's composed by these elementary experiences, but it has additional topological structure. So one could think of it metaphorically as being decomposed into certain regions or certain subsets, which then are hypothesized to correlate to the different objects which we see, which we experience. So there are many different things which one should say something about in more detail. The first is the composition, the elementary experience, which kind of make up this phenomenal space. What are they? Well, one assumption would be that elementary experiences which enter this construct of a phenomenal space are fundamentally extended. They're not point-like, they are more like spots. So I give another metaphor here. Experiences are like a melody. Melodies unfold over time. They don't happen at an instant in time, but they happen now, but this now is kind of structured. It's an extended moment. And there was one philosopher who was very impressed when he was younger. He was very impressed by this idea of extended Gestalt-like experiences and how they hang together. And that was Rudolf Carnap. That was before Carnap became a very hard-nosed analytic philosopher. He wrote a book called The Logical Structure of the World. And there he tried to reconstruct all the concepts we have in terms of relations between such elementary experiences, which were taken to be complex and Gestalt-like. So Carnap was very influenced by psychology of that time. So the original work, the German work, was like 1920 or so. And their Gestalt psychology was very in fashion. So he took what Gestalt psychologists said about experiences to be telling him what are experiences in a very elementary sense. And the question for Carnap and also for me then became, how could one think about structures between such extended entities? It seems to be a bit different than the usual mathematical project where you start with kind of set of points or point-like entities. And Carnap came up with the idea of similarity as a criterion which defines some structure between these extended elements. So the criterion of similarity, Carnap kind of worked on this more, I would say not formally, but later philosophers, they actually tried to give a more formal account of this similarity. And that's what I would do in the next step. So what is the basic structure that defines these phenomenal spaces? And the first step is to think about mereology. Mereology is known as the structure of part-whole relations. So what Carnap conceived of as similarity between extended elements could be formalized into what in mereology is known as the relation of overlap. Overlap is a symmetric notion. So A overlaps with B, implies that B overlaps with A. It defines the structure of part-whole relations. I just said something is a part of something else if everything that overlaps with one thing also overlaps with the other thing. And other mereological concepts like disjointness, they could be derived from this simple notion of mereological overlap. And one of these notions that could be derived is a sense in which entities, in which experiences or complexes of experiences could be thought as being connected to each other. I wrote the formula on my slides. I won't try to read that in words. You can do that for yourself. I just note that the idea is to redefine the notion of connection between experiences in terms of a complexification of the notion of overlap. Now, if you look at it, the nice thing is if you take mereologically connected entities and you just take sets of mereologically connected entities, this defines a structure which is called a pre-topology. For the mathematicians, they might be interested. The way how this is constructed satisfies 3 out of 4 Kuratowski axioms, which kind of inform you whether you have a topology or not. So there's one criterion missing in order to get to real topological structure. So it seems that one ingredient in this whole Carnapian mereological connectivity idea is actually missing to get to the notion of a topological space, which is what I want to have to model experiences. So, well, which ingredient is missing, and can consult the literature on this. There has been much written about the relation between mereology and topology. And one thing that one can find is that in addition to mereologically connected entities, one needs a notion of boundaries between these entities in order to get a proper topology on a space which is defined by these entities. Now, all the Kuratowski axioms are satisfied, idempotency is satisfied. It's very nice because this gives you a very basic sense in which you have a topological space now. So I have a toy example on this slide. You see a little graph, and all the nodes on the graph represent elementary experiences or the elements of our calculus, and the lines between the nodes represent this relation of mereological overlap. And in addition, you need to have a notion of boundary which you could impose on these spaces to give you the structure of a topology. And maybe more conceptually, the idea is that one can impose boundaries on such a pre-structured space, which generates a topology, which could be said to correlate to what one would call perceived objects in a very general sense. And the second thing which I note here in this construction, I think that's a very, very, very nice feature. I start with a quote from Rudolf Carnap again, who said that contemporary psychology has confirmed that the total impression is epistemically primary and the so-called individual impression are achieved through abstraction therefrom. So he kind of reverses the image which we have of psychological states. He says something like, well, it's not the, let's say, the elementary qualia which kind of composes phenomenal space which is primary, but it's the overall phenomenal space which is primary, and a notion of an individual impression of a single quale inside this space is more of an abstraction than actually a real primary thing. And the way how one could mathematically model this in terms of the phenomenal spaces which I just introduced is to use projectors, which kind of impose when you project on a, let's say, a unitary space, which kind of gives you the relation of standing in a mereological overlap, or standing in connection, or standing or getting to a boundary. So what one could do, one could re-axiomatise the whole construction in terms of such projectors, something which I call a projective mereological calculus. And I would hypothesize, I would claim that that's a very nice and comparatively simple picture of how to approach subjectivity in a very formal way. So maybe to summarize this part of my talk, I briefly talked about these 3 characteristics or dimensions to experience which one would like to model, and I've introduced a little bit a notion of a phenomenal space. And now the question is, how would the construct of a phenomenal space account for these dimensions, which I mentioned before? So the first was situatedness. Experiences are somehow embedded in the milieu, and I think there it's kind of straightforward. One take these extended elements which enter the calculus and say that they stand for or correlate or derive to, it's not quite clear what the notion is really supposed to be, interaction of a subject, of an experiencing subject with its milieu. The second point is the unity. There are two senses in which phenomenal spaces are unitary. There's one trivial compositional sense. It's just a unit with respect to all the elements which enter it. I think that's one sense of unity. There's a second sense of unity, which comes with the imposing of a boundary structure on that, leads to something like well-defined regions or subsets in that space, which could be thought as being somehow picking out units in your space. And the third claim is the transcendentalist claim. It's a very weak claim in this model. Many philosophers do have a much stronger claim about transcendentalism. I don't go into the metaphysical details here. I just want to note that the structure which is imposed, or the structure of a topological space, is somehow imposed on a pre-structured background, and together with situatedness, this implies that the objects which we perceive are given as abstractions from the totality of situated experience. That's the quote by Carnap here. So the concept of phenomenal space could be thought to account quite well for these three dimensions of experience. Okay, so that was my first part. Everything which I said in the last couple minutes could be understood as being like a descriptive tool for the structure, for the study of experience. I think it's a good thing. If one could really work out all the details here, that would be quite an accomplishment. But methodologically, I tried not to say something about the relation of experience to the physical world. So that's a very important concept to get. It was never about how to get from the brain to the mind or something else. Phenomenologists have a term for this. They call it the phenomenological reduction, or the epoché, which means to denote the fact that one tries to suppress any judgment about how the mind hangs together with the physical world. Now, more philosophically speaking, the above can be seen as an epistemological project. So it's whether and how experience could be formalized or can't be formalized. It was not an ontological project. So it's not something that tells us about what is real or what is not, what is primary, what is fundamental. But as the people here in the seminar probably are quite well aware, there is quite a big ontological problem that stands behind all of this, and that's the mind-body problem, or mind-matter problem. I like the term mind-body problem. It's a bit old-fashioned, but I like old-fashioned terms. So anyway, that's the problem that stands behind it, and eventually one needs to say something about the mind-body problem. And that's what I will do in the remaining few slides of my talk. So I want to start and contrast my research attitude with something that is known, which I would call physicalism or physicalist naturalism. Physicalism is a philosophical term, and it's a bit of a difficult term because many people use it, but they mean slightly different things. That's why I chose the formulation of physicalist naturalism. Usually it's an ontological claim. Everything that exists is or supervenes, that's a technical term, on the physical. Plus, to make this a bit more, to get a bit more beef into this definition, there's a methodological claim that says that everything that exists could be more or less explained using the language of our best physics. More or less, there are some effects which, of course, physics cannot explain at the moment, like quantum gravity, but most people who work in chemistry or biology, for example, they don't believe that it is really of importance to the mind-body problem at all. So I would say the mainstream opinion of physicalists is something like that. We have more or less what we know, how chemistry and biology works, electromagnetic interaction, basically, and from this we can construct a biological theory of consciousness. And if you ask physicalists, or if you listen to physicalists' talks, they usually come with an example that kind of justifies their position, or they say that tells you why their position is very superior to any other position. And the success story, as I call it, but it's really only a story, is the phenomenon of life, the emergence of life or vitalism. There was a debate around 1900. It's still, I think it was settled in 1920, 1930, so it was quite a long debate about how to explain phenomena of life, explain the living. And there was a school called vitalism. Vitalists believed that there is a necessity to invoke some extra physical principle or force to explain living phenomena. There are different names for this force: vital impetus, or élan vital, that was coined by a French philosopher, Henri Bergson. He meant something a little bit more complicated by it, but usually it's kind of subsumed under this whole idea of vitalism. Now, today, most biologists would say that vitalism is kind of outdated concept. It's more of a metaphysical idea. Maybe some say it's even pseudoscience. But I want to know two things. First, that vitalists, I don't believe that they're right, but they were conceptually, their thinking was impeccable. So the vitalists just thought, they said, well, in order to explain living phenomena, you need to have something like a concept of teleology, of goal-directedness. And standard physicalism at this time, which is basically classical physics, doesn't have this concept. So it follows either classical physics or physicalism need to be enriched by this concept of teleology, or it need to be abandoned completely. So I think vitalists were right in noting this conceptual problem that physicalism had in order to explain living phenomena. They were not successful, however, in proposing experiments that would show why their position is superior. They actually did propose experiments, so they were not pseudoscience. They were quite a well-established scientific enterprise, but those experiments failed in the end. So they were not successful. But it's a bit of a fairy tale story to say that vitalism was kind of metaphysical, outdated, unscientific idea. It was a very scientific idea, but not a successful one. Now, many people or many physicalists will say that consciousness will eventually undergo this vitalism. So, more about the human brain, for example, we will not be bothered by consciousness at all. And I think that's a very difficult claim. It's hard to sustain. There are a couple of arguments, philosophical arguments to the contrary. They're very well known. There are arguments of invented spectra, arguments of zombies, arguments of conceivability, arguments of knowledge gaps, etc., etc. I don't want to go into detail here, but I want to note that something which is very similar to what actually happened to the vitalist is also happening here. Namely, standard physicalism as it stands right now does not even have conceptual space to allow for subjectivity in the framework. So we need to get rid of subjectivity, we need to eliminate it, explain it away, and then we might be successful. But then the question is whether that is really something which we believe is possible, which is possible. Personally, I don't believe it's possible. So it's at the moment, I think it's hard to tell. There are arguments for each side, but I think it's not an explanatory problem. The so-called hard problem of consciousness is less an explanatory problem. It's not really a problem, but it's more of a conceptual issue. It's more of a puzzle. So it really has to do with your presuppositions which you bring into that problem. So it's a metaphysical puzzle and not a scientific problem. Anyway, given this situation, if one wants to acknowledge the reality of subjective experience, one has basically two possibilities. One possibility is to embrace a view which is called emergentism. where you think something like, well, if you have physical objects and they're very complex and very many of them, somehow this will give rise to consciousness. There's been a emergentism is around for quite a long time, but it hasn't been successful so far. But it's still very appealing to a lot of physicalists because it seems to be kind of consistent with a physicalist image. The second approach, which I favor personally, is actually that we need a new ontological view, a new metaphysical view, where experiences or precursors of experiences, the bare essentials, which I was talking about earlier, are somehow conceptual primitive notions. They are somehow fundamental to the theory. And if one is interested in that approach and in constructing a theory based on these philosophical ideas, then I think there are some considerations, some general features which this primitive concept should be about. So experience, the primitive concept in the new metaphysical theory, is on the one hand more fundamental than physical objects. So that's really a hard claim. It's not a claim of dualism. You don't have physical objects and you have subjective experiences which kind of live inside these objects. Objects are less fundamental than experiences. The second claim is experience refers to processes, not to static things. It's a bit of a logical point. If it were the other way, then it's hard to see how experiences, what I call experiences, are actually different or could be fundamental to physical objects. And the third point, which is quasi-methodological, is a perspectivity point. Experiences do have something like an internal sense to them. That's the subjective component, but also a sense in which experiences appear to other experiences. Some maybe less important claims, which I think will be correct about experiences, they do not happen at an instant in time. That's this idea of experiences being extended moments or defining expanded moments. But experiences take some time, whatever time means in this setting, to unfold. So with experiences, with processes of experiences, there comes something like a subjective time, or maybe more a more physical notion, an eigentime, which is related to every experience. Not a general time in the framework, but an eigentime to experience. And the second thing about experiences is, which has to do with this first point, that experiences are thought to be more fundamental than physical objects, that experience underlies structure of the physical world. So structure is really something that is generated in the course of experiences interacting with each other. So that's a bit of a different view, what is maybe fashionable in a lot of philosophical discussions, where physics gives you the structure of the world and experience is kind of the inside of this structure. It's really a harder claim that structure of the physical world is somehow supervenient on this experience. One needs to explain in the end how this structure comes about. So maybe to give you a metaphor, to have a bit more of an idea how this could work. Many might know cellular automata and the nice Conway's game of life. There you have very simple elements which follow some rules and which give you more complex patterns. And the idea would be that the theory which has experiences as primitive is kind of analogous in some senses it's not analogous. I can explain that in a discussion if you want. So the elementary processes of experience which will enter our theory might correspond to something like the unit cells in a game of life. Experiences interact with each other. One could say they send signals to each other, which corresponds to what is known as an updating rule in cellular automata theory, and emergence of patterns between interacting experiences would correspond to something like physical structure or objective structure. Now, maybe I will sketch you in a minute. If you start with such a theory, one of the desiderata is, of course, to say something about consciousness. I mean, that was really the starting point. And I'm thinking about consciousness here. The problem with the term consciousness is that it's usually understood in two senses. In one sense, people who speak about consciousness often mean something which is very fundamental. And that's what I call experience. The second sense in which people are talking about consciousness is to talk about consciousness in terms of a very particular biological phenomenon, which appears in humans, maybe in some higher animals. And those two senses of consciousness are often conflated, and I would like to try to keep them separate. So the first sense of consciousness was, I called it subjective experience. And the second sense of consciousness, I call it just consciousness. But in the literature, you often find notions like meta-consciousness or cognitive consciousness that kind of tries to get to the phenomenon. So if you have a theory that starts with elementary experiences, then one would like to get to consciousness in terms of consciousness being something like a complexification of interaction between experiences. I think that's the main idea. What the theory should explain, of course, some properties which are usually attributed to consciousness, the phenomenality, the unity, the relation of consciousness to attention, to representation. But it's important to note that these properties about consciousness, they need not be taken as being axiomatic properties or metaphysically brute facts about the world. They could represent just derived notions on the basis of this elementary experience. So I talked a little bit about the unity of consciousness in the first part of my talk. As an example, the unity of consciousness need not designate some brute fact about consciousness, some axiomatic property of consciousness. Consciousness is, by definition, something that is unified, but it might be a notion which is just derived and which could also break down in various situations. And that's what we actually clinically observe, for example, in split brain patients. So the idea is actually that what we conceive of as unitary consciousness within one single organism is actually more of a derived notion that is based on the interaction between many different centers for consciousness. The second thing pertains to the notion of qualia. Qualia are often thought to be the ultimate givens of consciousness, but I would contend that qualia might be actually just an abstraction which is based on this more fundamental process of experiencing. A methodological point, there should be an evolutionary story. So if you look at the tree of life or at the evolution of life, you will see many instances of quasi or of mental looking properties which appear, so perception, cognition, and stuff like that. And so I think there's an evolutionary story to tell about the evolution of consciousness in terms of a complexification of experience. And the last point which I would like to mention is that in order to gain some, well, I would say, in order to get some beef, in order to be really scientific theory, there should be a sense in which consciousness makes actually a difference for an organism. It shouldn't be, I think it shouldn't be an epiphenomenal, a so-called epiphenomenal theory of consciousness where it actually really doesn't make any effect whether you're conscious or not. I think it's actually, it makes a difference whether you're conscious or not. So more generally said, a theory that starts with experience and ends with consciousness should kind of give a biologically realistic model which satisfies various physical constraints like energy conservation, which is able to state correlations between first and third person reports. That's related to the neural correlates of consciousness. A theory which kind of explains the seemingly gradual increase of mind in nature. That's the evolutionary story which I was appealing to. So there are bacteria which have a sense of perception. There are plants which are said to have a sense of cognition. It's a hot topic now, emotions in insects, where the insects have something like precursor elements of emotions or feelings. There's research on social behavior of animals. I think that all should eventually come out from the theory. And last but not least, of course, there are a couple of empirical predictions in psychology. So I talked about split brain patients. There are also things like agnosia, blindsight, various psychiatric conditions which should be explained in the end by a theory which starts by experience. So actually, I'm finished with my talk. I thank you very much for your attention. I want to thank my past and present research colleagues. One of them, I think, is here, Chetan Prakash. It's always a pleasure to work with other people, and I benefited a lot from the discussions and insights with my colleagues. So the mistakes, of course, are all mine, but I want to acknowledge my colleagues here explicitly. If you're interested in some of what I said today, you will find two links here to some papers. One is more technical, one is more philosophical, which you might read in order to disagree or not. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm looking forward to any questions.